Hello and welcome to the second part of my 386 restoration. In the last part I took care of this case, fixed it, retro-brighted the plastic parts and painted the cover. I also installed all the basic hardware to get the system up and running. And in this part it is all about to make the system absolutely awesome. In the last part, I browsed through the data on the hard drive, but there was nothing particularly interesting. So first of all, let's wipe the hard drive and reinstall DOS to have a clean base. Therefore, I would like to share a shortcut with you which I usually take to set up my retro machines. For this purpose, I use this ISA network adapter and this magic floppy disk. To set up a DOS-based system, I temporarily insert the network adapter into the PC and boot from the floppy. It contains a minimal set of MS-DOS files along with fdisk and format to create and format partitions. Furthermore, it has a packet driver for named network adapter and the FTP server tool from MTCP project. So let's first recreate disk partitions. I split the hard drive into two parts, C and D, where all the stuff can go onto C and D can be used as a backup whatsoever. C is going to be the primary partition with 256 megabytes, and the rest goes for extended D partition. The primary partition should be always made active if you want to be able to boot from it. After a reboot, we are back in DOS, booted from the floppy drive. Now we can format the partitions. C shall be our boot partition, so with the argument /s, format will also install system files onto the drive C. Now where the drives are prepared, we can simply change into net directory on the floppy. In this directory we have the packet driver and the FTP server. The batch file ftp-srv is prepared and will initialize everything, acquire an IP address using DHCP, and start the FTP server, giving the full access to the drives. And on another machine, I can now just connect to the server and simply copy all I need directly onto the drive C of the retro machine, including full MS-DOS, drivers, games, tools, and pre-configured autoexec.bat and config.sys. So after everything was copied, I just have to reboot the machine and I will land in DOS startup menu with different pre-configured memory setups. And as you see, even the Unisound driver for a sound card gets already started. However, currently there is no sound card installed. And as you see, I have now Norton Commander clone named Volkov Commander at hand, and on the drive we have all the stuff previously transferred over the FTP. Good so far. I used this Realtek network card for the setup, but it is not the best network adapter out there. Since I want this PC to be something special, I would like to use only the best parts which I have at hand. And the best ISA network card is a 3-COM Ethernet Link 3. I think this PC deserves to have this card in its slots. I already copied the packet drivers to the hard drive, so the network card will help to transfer data from and to the PC easily. Now let's get to the exciting part and run some benchmarks. In Landmark, we are getting about 67 points for CPU and nothing for FPU, since we have none. With the turbo off, there are almost 25 CPU points. In sysinfo, we are getting 40 points with turbo and around 13.5 without. In 3D Bench, we are getting 15.7 points. In PC Player benchmark, only 3.6, and it's more of a slideshow. Here is an interesting benchmark by NSSI, and here the system is rated right below of the AMD 386DX40, which we actually have here, so there is space for optimization. And what a benchmark without Doom. Sure, this game runs very slowly, but even a fastest 386 is not a good choice for this game. In the end, the system makes 2,134 game ticks in 10,707 real ticks, which corresponds to about only 7 FPS. And here is an overview of the speed-seize test. The CPU speed is at 9 points, which is about right. I made the hard drive speed test just for completeness, and the results seem to be normal for an old mechanical drive. More interesting is the bottom right graph. The system has 64 kilobytes of cache. Beside building a nice retro PC, I would like to answer some interesting questions as well. So the first upgrade step is going to be the cache. Currently, this machine has 8 chips, each 8 kilobytes in size. Makes 64 kilobytes altogether. These 3 ICs down here are also called cache tag. Usually, when upgrading the cache, these tag chips needs to be upgraded as well. However, according to the documentation, the configuration for the tag ICs is always the same. Doesn't matter if you want to use 64 kilobytes or 256 kilobytes of cache. Here I have 8 times 32 kilobytes cache ICs, so let's try them here. Unfortunately, there are 25 nanoseconds, but they should be fast enough, I guess. Furthermore, these are the only ones I currently have. Now where the ICs are in the sockets, I have to set these jumpers accordingly to the documentation. And here we go, the system boots and it says 256 kilobytes of cache. Let's run some benchmarks again. First of all, speed sees to check if the cache is working at all. And here you go, the I/O performance drop is now at 256 kilobytes and not at 64 kilobytes as before. This means that the cache is working indeed. Well, in landmark, nothing changed. We have the same 67 points. In sysinfo as well, 40 points again. In 3D bench, however, we have a slight increase from 15.7 to 16.8 points. In PC player benchmark, we got from 3.6 to 3.8 points. And in Doom, also a very slight increase from 10,707 ticks to 10,196 ticks. Okay, that was not much of an improvement. Anyway, an awesome 386 has to have an awesome amount of cache, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I guess it is time to make some tweaks in the BIOS. Here, Advanced Chipset Setup is the main viewpoint we want. Here you can set up some timings for the memory and cache. Changing these settings can make your system quite unstable. It is quite a lot of trial and fail, and I would like not to bother you with that. So I experimented off camera a little bit, and these are the settings which turned out to be fast and stable so far. Let's briefly go over it. First one you want to activate is Hidden Refresh. The D in DRAM stands for dynamic. This type of memory is used on the RAM modules. It is cheaper than so-called static RAM or SRAM, which is, by the way, used for the cache, but it has a serious drawback. The memory cells in such a DRAM chips needs to be periodically refreshed, or the IC will forget the bits. What does that mean? The memory in such a DRAM IC is ordered in tables, where every table entry is a bit 0 or 1. These table entries need to be rewritten every now and then. Therefore, the system sends so-called refresh signal to the memory to make a round over all entries in it. During such a refresh cycle, the memory is inaccessible, so from the performance point of view, it is important to make this refresh as rare as possible. Back to the BIOS settings. Many DRAM ICs have a feature called Hidden Refresh, which increases the speed of refresh a lot. I will not go into details now how exactly it works, but you want to enable it. If your memory modules are new enough, it will improve the performance of your system. The second entry is called Slow Refresh, and the name is very misleading here. Many people think that slow is bad and leave this option disabled. In fact, this is one of the most important speed-up options here, and you want to enable it. In this case, slow doesn't mean something bad. The full name of the option means slow refresh rate. So if enabled, the refresh happens about 10 times less often, and the system gets more responsive and fast, since it doesn't waste so much time refreshing the memory. However, your memory modules have to be not too old to be able to handle this. Older modules will need fast refresh rate, and enabling this feature would make the system unstable. How to find out if your memory can handle this? Well, either by experiment or reading the datasheets for the ICs on your memory modules. Another important settings are memory wait states. They define how long the CPU has to wait to complete write or read operation. For this board, it turned out to be safe to set all wait states to 0, except for DRAM writing where 1 seems to be sufficient. And here some tests. Landmark rose from 67 to 69 points. Sysinfo went from 40 to over 43 points. And Doom cracked the magic limit of 10,000 now to 9,766 real ticks. How about to run something more demanding, like Quake? Oops, if I start the game, it crashes with an error. But why? Well, because Quake needs an FPU to run and the socket is still empty. In the first part, I already replaced the 386DX33 CPU, which was in this mainboard before, by a 40 MHz version. In the comments, there were a couple of questions if I would like to add a math coprocessor. And the answer is of course. In an awesome 386, there should be no empty sockets, don't you think? That's why I thought to install this ULSI 40 MHz FPU first. It would make a good company to the previously installed 386DX40. However, there is something else I would like to try. Let me remove the CPU again. In the comments last time, I got a tip to use a slot bracket to pull out the CPUs, and since the space is quite tight and I don't want to get the whole mainboard out of the case again, I will give it a try. And it seems to work quite good, I would say. Good, so here we go. This AM386DX40 CPU was the fastest official 386 CPU available. Intel's fastest 386DX was a 33 MHz, and only AMD went further and introduced a 40 MHz version. The CPU and FPU pair would make a perfect 386 experience, but I promised you an awesome 386, didn't I? So I decided to push the limits a little bit. AM386DX40 is the fastest 386 CPU, yes, but it is not the fastest CPU you can have in a 386 mainboard. In the year 1992, Cyrix introduced a CX486DLC CPU, which was technically a 486 CPU, which was adopted to be a drop-in replacement for a 386DX. The CPUs were produced by Texas Instruments for Cyrix and ran at 25, 33, and 40 MHz. I have one such CPU with Texas Instruments print, but you can find the same one also with Cyrix name on top. The benefits of this CPU are not only 486 instructions, which were added on top of the 386, but even more important, it has 1 kilobyte level 1 cache, which is not much, but can make a huge performance push. To give it the appropriate FPU power, I will equip the 486 DLC with this math coprocessor. This should give it some additional power. So, as I said, technically it is not a 386 anymore, but it has the same pinout as a 386 and should give us the most out of the system. Since the mainboard is still the same 386 one, I would say it's a 386 with an upgrade. However, I'd be interested if you would prefer to go with the pure 386 system or also use this upgrade. Please write into the comments what do you think about it. Just as always, pay attention to the polarity. The CPU and FPU both have a marker in the corner which should align with a marking on the socket. It is easier to double check it twice than to burn your hardware once. Let's start the system. It posts, and we are getting 8046 detected. So far, so good. Let's start some benchmarks and see if something changes. Sysinfo detects the CPU properly. Cyrix 486 40 MHz. What does the benchmark say? Well, it rose from 43 to over 48. Could I overestimate the power a little bit? But Landmark went up from 69 points to incredible 126. That's not bad at all. Furthermore, now you can see the FPU with 140 points where we got no result previously at all. Doom is still not really playable, but feels a bit faster and ends up with 8,784 real ticks. It is an improvement of 12 to 13%. Now, where the system has an FPU, it should be able to finally run Quake. And it does indeed. However, it is more like a round-based strategy than a first-person shooter. The time demo ends up with 1.9 FPS. Well, at least it is now able to start it. Well, honestly, I'm a little bit disappointed by the results. I expected it to be better. Interesting is that speed test tool doesn't say anything about level 1 cache. Also, cache test says that the system has only one cache of 256 kilobytes. At this point, I have to thank Peter from CPU Galaxy YouTube channel for his work. With his video about a Cyrix SXL2, he saved me a lot of time and pointed out where to start. I will put the link to his video down into the description. If a mainboard doesn't support the Cyrix CPU features in BIOS, there is a tool which makes it possible to activate and deactivate different features of such CPUs from DOS. Using it with argument -h, you can see the list of all options. With -q, you can see the state of the current settings. The used Cyrix or Texas Instruments CPU, whatever you like better, has 1 kilobyte of internal level 1 cache, as I already mentioned. This cache has to be activated either in BIOS, if it has official support for it, or using this tool. Well, the cache is activated by default to be precise, but the first non-cacheable region is set from 0 to 4 GB, which is the entire memory space of the PC, since a 32-bit CPU, which a 386 or 486 is, can address up to 4 GB of RAM. So, as you can see, the cache is effectively disabled. Cache activation is controlled by the 486 specific 32-bit register called CR0, which is usually set so that the cache is enabled. But you also have to disable the non-cacheable area to really activate the level 1 cache. The level 1 cache on the CPU can be eventually enabled by using argument -e -f -i1. The -e argument enables the cache flag. The -f is for performance reasons, and the -i1 deactivates non-cacheable areas. The -f argument says how to synchronize the cache and the RAM. It could lead to errors on some systems, so please read the documentation or simply don't use it. Now the level 1 cache should be working again. Let's see what landmark test says. And bam! The score went from 126 up to 167. This is a good sign. Let's take a look at sysinfo. Also here the number rose from around 44 to over 65. That's almost 50% faster. In Doom, we still don't get very high frame rates, but it already feels a lot smoother. And the final result is 6,382 real ticks. Not bad compared to 8,700 without level 1 cache, or even almost 10,000 with a normal 386 DX40. NSSI now shows this system somewhere below a real 486 DX33. This corresponds to the reports on the internet that this 40 MHz Cyrix 486 DLC upgrade is about as fast as a 486 25 MHz. Also, the FPU shows pretty good results. And last but not least, the absolute killer of a benchmark for this machine, Quake. It is still a slideshow, hands down. There is no way to play this game on such a PC. However, it runs and it makes mind-blowing 2 FPS. Running all the benchmarks, the CPU temperature got actually quite high, almost 70 degrees with open case. These CPUs were used without any cooler at all back in the days, but I'd like to reduce the stress on it a little bit and will add a small heatsink. The die of the CPU is in the middle of the ceramic body, so it's not necessary to have a heatsink which is exactly in the same size. Unfortunately, this is currently the only one I have, and I guess it is better to have a small one than none at all. After half an hour of benchmarks, the CPU temperature was now right under 60 degrees Celsius. This is about 10 degrees less than before. Still quite hot, but better than before. Here are all the results of my tests so far. Almost all changes I made resulted in a measurable difference. It was also unexpected for me that increasing the cache from 64 kilobytes to 256 kilobytes gave no or almost no benefit at all. As you can see, the BIOS optimizations can bring some extra performance, but it is not a panacea and usually just looks cool on the benchmarks. If a game is not playable on a machine, it will not be magically playable by some tweaking in the BIOS. At some point, you just need to upgrade the hardware, and this is visible in the benchmarks very well, since the most performance increase was reached with the CPU upgrade to the TI 486 DLC. And here it was very important to tweak the settings, since through proper activation of level 1 cache, I could get another 30% of performance out of the machine. However, with slightly less than 12 FPS, Doom still remains barely playable on this machine. Well, with the reduced window size and a lot of will, you can try it, but I suggest something beefier for that game. Anyway, a 3D6 or this 3D6-ish Cyrix machine is just something from days before Doom, and there we get a lot of very cool games which we could play on it. And where I'm talking about games, how can it be an awesome PC without a sound card? So let's take a look at what I got for it. I have a huge collection of sound cards from different years. For this machine, I sorted out some options here. First of all, there is this Sound Blaster 2.0. I like this card very much, not because of its history, but also because it supports Creative Music System FM sound. Maybe you saw my video about reverse engineering of the logic chip for this card. It is super retro, but this sound card is quite noisy and it doesn't support Stereo Sound Blaster Pro sound. I think this card is better suited for a low-end 386 or even 286 PC. On the other hand, there is this Creative AWE64, a really good sound card with an excellent audio quality, 16-bit stereo sound and general MIDI emulation. It delivers outstanding performance, but it has two flaws. First, it is by far too new for this machine, since this sound card was used in late Pentium and Pentium 2 Windows 95-98 PCs. This one is, for example, from 1997. Second, it has no original Yamaha OPL3 sound, but such called CQM emulation by Creative. Not only does it sound differently, it sounds also sometimes very wrong in the old DOS games. And since this machine shall be specifically for DOS gaming, maybe there is a better choice. Okay, staying with Creative, there is this cost-reduced Sound Blaster 16. It has almost the same problems as the AWE64. Even if the compatibility and the audio quality is not bad, it is too new and doesn't have the original OPL3 FM sound as well. In the comments to the first part of this restoration, it was suggested to use an ESS sound card like this one. It is indeed not bad, the sound quality is okay, the compatibility with Sound Blaster Pro is outstanding. It also doesn't have the original OPL3 sound, but ESS own implementation is one of the best and sounds very similar to the original OPL3 from Yamaha, even if it is slightly different here and there. So I thought that it might be a really good idea to go with this one. However, as I told in my last video, the space in this case is a problem. Things are sitting quite tightly. So speaking of ESS sound cards, I have basically the same sound card here in such a triangular form. It is really the same sound card, but it takes less space and could be installed right over the IDE controller, where a full-size card would not fit well anymore. I even have two of such cards. They are same, but one with green and one with yellow PCB. And since I started to talk about triangular cards, here is another option. Aztec Sound Galaxy Multimedia Pro 163S. Also an interesting sound card. It was made in cooperation with Yamaha and it has a genuine Yamaha OPL3 sound integrated into the chip. Here you can even see the OPL inscription. So this sound card sounds 100% like the true Adlib or Sound Blaster Pro, what gives it additional retro bonus. One side note on this card is that it has a power connector for external devices like speakers or MPU 401 MIDI devices. It delivers 6 volts or 9 volts, which can be set using a jumper on the card. Yeah, not an easy decision, but for now I decided to go with Aztec sound card. Maybe I will change it in the future, but for now I'd like to have the original OPL3 sound in this machine. By the way, all the sound cards I showed to you are supported by the universal sound card driver Unisound, which you can find on Vogoons. I will put the link into the description. And this driver simplifies the switch between the different sound cards dramatically. Just swap the hardware and turn on the PC. That's all. The system runs super reliably and is almost perfect now, but some cosmetics left to do. The 7-segment display on the front switches between 40 and 8 MHz, which is not quite precise, I guess. This is just an indicator without an actual meaning, but we want to make it perfect, don't we? So, in Season 4, the system makes about 65.5 points in full speed, and with turbo off, it is around 22. A simple relation tells us that if 65.5 points are 40 MHz, then 22 must be round about 14 MHz. I reset the jumpers accordingly, and here go, it switches now between 40 and 14 MHz. All the ISO slots are almost full, but one slot left for further expansion. Who knows, there are plenty of possibilities. It was definitely worth it to extend the riser card with additional 16-bit slots. And finally, I think I can put the cover back. As I told in the last part, I painted it multiple times and every layer dried at least 6 hours. After that, the cover dried couple of days more and should be now ready to get in place. It turned out quite well, definitely better than before. The color, RAL 9001, has a slight shade of cream, but only on the second side. I think slightly grayish REL 9003 would be a better choice, but I'm also quite happy with this result. And last but not least, one very important thing left to do. A big thank you to Hexe from the German DOS Reloaded DE community for this glorious MS-DOS badge, which adds the final missing piece of awesomeness to this glorious machine. It took much more time to rebuild this incredible PC than I planned, but I'm really happy with the result. It turned out to be a super powerful 386 or super weak 486, depends on how you look at it, but the parts inside are really special. Great 386 mainboard, 40 MHz TI 486 DLC CPU, an IIT FPU, 8 MB of RAM, 256 KB of level 2 cache, ET4000 graphics card with 1 MB of video memory, Sound Blaster Pro compatible Aztec sound card with real OPL3 FM, 3-COM Etherlink 3 network adapter, 500 MB hard drive, and quad-speed Mitsumi CD-ROM drive. All in all, an amazing combination. What do you think? I hope you enjoyed this restoration. Eventually, it turned out to be even more than that. I finally made some interesting tests, which I planned to do for a long time, but never had time to do so. If you liked it, you know what to do, and if not, I guess as well. And this is it from me for today. Thank you, and goodbye.